Okay, and welcome back to our second part of the source analysis lecture. Okay, so when you sit this assessment, you have already constructed a source document set using 3 sources. These are the questions that you'll have to use to analyse those sources. So let's have a quick look at those. Okay. So in source analysis, you'll know what the questions are before you answer them in class. Your constructed booklet is the source set for these questions. Okay, so when you come in to sit the in-class component of this, you will bring in your source document set. And it's very neat. It has clearly marked on it source 1, source 2, source 3, and you have that provenance underneath. Author, origin, date, and you can have a little explanation. Okay, so that's really important. There are 5 marks attached to the booklet and how it looks. Okay, so these are the questions, there's 9 of them, that you will be asked. You will need to identify the message of source 1. You will need to identify the message of source 2. You will need to identify the purpose of source 1. And you will need to identify the purpose of source 2. Then you must compare the purpose of source 1 and source 2. So there's got to be similarities between source 1 and source 2 in the purpose. And we'll look at what that means a little bit further on. Then you've got to list the differences between the purpose of source 1 and source 2. So when you're constructing your booklet, you've got to make sure that there are some differences between purpose. And we'll look at purpose in a little bit more detail in a minute. It's just to sort of start thinking about how you're going to set out these sources in the best way that you can answer the questions. Then for source 3, you're just identifying the focus of the source. In question 8, you're outlining the causes or events that led to the focus of source 3, so the things that happened beforehand. And then basically looking back at source 3 in reference to the focus of source 3, provide specific details of the context, including key events, people, ideas, dates, and places. And then I've put A here. It's a bit weird, I know. It's not really a question. It's just the section that is also worth 5 marks is a neat booklet with all the conventions that we looked at before addressed. Excuse me. The best way to have a look at it is to really look at the marking key because that's how you're going to answer the question. It's how you're going to think about how you will construct your source set as well. But before that, I think it might be really useful to have a little look at the fact sheet that you should have from your teacher. I have one on the OneNote. So just having a look here, again, that's sort of a few questions. Our origin, we look at on our source book. What I want to go to first is message. Okay, these are the first 2 questions that you're going to be asked. So, identifying message in a source. What are the key ideas shown in the source and how are they shown? You have to really have an example. The reason why you've got to have an example is that sometimes people will get different things from sources. If you have a look at a picture, you might say, oh, that looks like a picture of the trenches. And you might look at the weapons, or you might, focus on the environment. Someone else might look at that and have a look at the uniforms. They might look at the command structure in the trenches. It just depends on what your perspective is, and everyone will have maybe slightly different ways of looking at something. So if you identify a message and it might not be exactly right, but you give an example from your source to show your thinking, 9 times out of 10 you'll still get the mark for that. Now, this is a really good little warning here. Be careful not to simply describe what you see. We're not asking you to tell us what you see in the source. We can see it. Okay, so for instance, if you go back to one of the pictures, the little kid sort of standing, a little boy standing on the spinning jenny, the message of that source is not there is a child that's working in a factory. The message is that children as young as 3 or 5 were used as operators of machinery. So it's kind of sort of similar, but you're not just describing what you see. Discuss what you think is being communicated and support this by examples from the source. As shown by is a great little sentence starters. And that's what you're looking for message. What are the key ideas? It might be conditions of of child labour. It could be, the message could be simply a message home in the form of a diary or a letter. There is lots of different messages behind sources, and that's really what you want to connect to there. Okay, so the next thing that gets very confusing is purpose. Purpose and message get confused all the time. Okay, so with that, it's like purpose is what is the text created for? What is the motive of the author or the creator of the source? Are they trying to explain, persuade, or are they trying to evoke a response? Purpose is a little bit more Englishy in some ways. You always want to know, what's the purpose of this text? What is it supposed to do? What does it want you to think, feel, or do? Now, I'm going to flick over to this little very helpful table, because what this does, it kind of gives you a little bit of a cheat sheet for what types of sources are generally, what their purposes generally are. Okay, so if you're looking at a political cartoon, and that's those, you see them nowadays, and they're usually used to provide a bit of a commentary on what's happening. Maybe it's to show public opinion. It could be to critique a particular government or particular policy. It could even be to ridicule a particular political leader. So what's the point of this? Why go to the trouble of drawing a cartoon, that's published? Okay, so the second type of text type we're looking at here is government things. Government documents, especially policy documents, and statements by political leaders, including speeches. Excuse me. What they tend to do is provide a justification for a particular policy or action. Now, you don't want to get stuck here and go, this speech by, Tony Abbott shows that he doesn't really like immigrants much. Okay. Now, that no political leader is standing in front of you wanting to show you something, okay? They normally want to talk about why they think their policy should be taken up, why it's a good idea to have a particular policy, or is to justify a decision made. So, standing up in front of your citizens to justify why you might introduce conscription is a really good purpose. It's a really good example of that. So when you see a speech or you use one, it's probably going to justify or provide a reason for a particular policy or action. Could be to persuade as well, just depends on the source. Now, the next examples are letters, diaries, journals, and memoirs, which are sort of, a bit like an autobiography in some ways, where they're looking back at their lives. Now, this is to actually provide a first-hand or personal accounts of events. It could be to reassure someone that they're okay. If you're sort of looking at something that's going to be published, it will probably just to be able to provide that first-hand account, and that's the purpose. Have a look at what sort of, again, looking at where it's coming from, who has produced it. The Diary of Anne Frank is a very good example. She never meant for it to be published, of course. She used it as a private journal, and that was really just to note down her experience of hiding, as a Jew in Nazi-occupied Amsterdam. basically. It was just really for her own use. However, that purpose has kind of changed over time because it was published after her death, and it has become like a classic piece of literature now. So maybe further on, the purpose is to educate people on the experience of the Jews in the in Nazi occupied territories. So they can change a little bit as well. So just really try and sort of work out that motivation by the author. Now, if you're looking at a textbook or a book maybe written by a historian, and usually the purpose of that is to provide a particular interpretation. And so you might have an historian that's trying to prove that, that their argument is better, basically, or their interpretation is something worth looking at. And there's so many different types of that. You might have one historian that might say that the invention of the telegraph pole was, the key turning point in the Industrial Revolution. And then you might have another historian that disagrees, that says, no, it's the invention of the of the steam engine that really fuels or drives the Industrial Revolution. So that's because historians have different perspectives, and usually that's what they are trying to do. They're trying to get that across. If you're looking at a textbook, it's usually for the purpose to educate and inform. Okay, so one of the more sort of maybe more familiar sources for you guys, I think, looking at how you look at them in English with persuasive text is propaganda. And you're looking here at propaganda is really those kind of persuasive texts that really deliberately set out to mislead, manipulate, or deceive the reader. And definitely recruitment posters can be a good example of that. So you might see that more in the World War I kind of source set, where, they're really trying to persuade people to join up. The war's not going well. So that sort of is really quite misleading. They might be, hey, help a mate out, or it's not so bad, have a free holiday, but really they're sending people to their deaths a lot of the time. So propaganda is like anything sort of persuasive, posters, speeches. That's really the purpose of that, is to persuade. Okay, so hopefully that little table helps somewhat. I'm just going to go up to the fact sheet. And really the next thing that you're looking at on this one is historical context. And that is the background that provides the important information. So really not doing a lot of source analysis for source 3. What you're looking at is, what do you know about the historical period? What are the key events? What are the key ideas? Who are the key people? And what are the key dates? And that's where your background knowledge comes in. Excuse me, and your knowledge about the time period. So if I've got a picture of the little kids working on the spinning jenny, I'm going to look at when child labour became a problem, all of the conditions, and maybe I'll also look at the laws that followed. So everything that's going on around the source. You don't actually even have to reference the source. So for your assessment, context, message, and purpose are the real focuses. Okay. Compare and contrast is really looking at how are they similar and how are they different. Okay, so they're the skills, sort of the concepts around the questions. So I'm going to stop it right there. That's the end of the second lecture. And if you'd like to come to the third lecture in a minute, and we can have a look at those questions and the marking key. Thanks for listening.